All right. So up until this point, this week, we have really been shifting away from more of the biological theories, the more medical explanations for how the brain works, and we're continuing on this transition to the more the more ethereal, the more theories based. As we last week we got into, we were talking about learning, we were talking about social psychology, how people act. We can predict how an individual might behave in a certain situation. However, you put them into multiple, like a group of people, and they act completely different, right? So we examine what part of that is nature, and what part of that is nurture, what part of that is environment. Where do we get our values, right? And that falls in line with Kohlberg's theory of moral development, which we also talked about a couple weeks ago. So this week, we're going to delve into personality. Now, personality is something that we develop at a very, very young age. And again, there are a lot of arguments as to what part of that is nature, what part of that is nurture, especially when we look at the excitability of a person. Like, for example, somebody might be inherently excitable, easily excitable. They're easily scared or something. That could fit into that personality, right? How their parents interact with them, and what kind of relationships they see conflict resolution going between the parents with their relationship. That builds personality, that fits into the personality. So all these things really go into personality. And like everything else in psychology, there's no one answer to describe that. We have different strokes for different folks, I think is probably the best way to describe that. So thinking about this as we're going through this, I want you to consider how you would describe your personality. Has anybody thought of that? Like, if they're reading through this material, have they thought about what their personality type is, or how would they describe themselves?
I know I'm outgoing, wild.
Yeah, okay. How about friendly? Maybe some of you might be described as creative or quirky or nervous or outgoing, back in the ancient Greek philosophers' days, there was this they started looking at personality. They noticed people were different. They acted differently than other people. They may have had thoughts or expressed thoughts or behaviors that were different. And again, so they isolated this to individual experiences, and they believed that it really manifested in four what they called humors. And basically, you are who you are because of a balance of blood and phlegm and black and yellow bile, because that's what they thought. They thought that it was some kind of medical explanation for how we behave the way we do. Traditional Chinese medicines suggest that our personalities depend on the balance of 5 elements, right? And any of you that have heard of that, and if you know what those elements are, it's great. But we might consider them to be earth, water, wind, metal, and fire. And even the Hindus have a different view of looking at unique combinations of 3 different mind-body principles called doshas, right? So we can really see theories all over the place. And it wasn't really until the 1900s when a man that you probably heard of called Sigmund Freud thought our personalities depend in part on who was winning the battle of urges between the id, ego, and superego. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that a little bit more here in just a minute, but I want to share my screen so I can take some notes and you can write some notes and all that good stuff. All right. Oh, bear with me. Hopefully this doesn't kick me off. All right, are you able to see my screen there? All right.
Yes.
All right, so let's talk about the psychoanalytic theory, okay? So Sigmund Freud developed the psychoanalytic theory of personality. And essentially, now you've probably heard of this guy Freud, right? We've talked about him in the past. So Sigmund Freud, it happens, just kind of a cool little fact here. He was not even a psychologist. He was a physician, more specifically a neurologist. And right around, I think it was like 1885, he went to Paris to study hypnosis with another neurologist. But this experience is really what turned him towards psychopathology and specifically psychiatry as we know it. So that's where he kind of began his work. So let's go back. Let's talk about the psychoanalytical theory. The psychoanalytical theory says that our childhood experiences really guide us into our personalities. Oh, oops. Childhood. Just going to abbreviate experiences because this is how I do it in my notes with patients and clients. Experiences guide us. Okay. Makes sense, right? They guide what's called our unconscious desires, and that influences our behaviors. So the key word to this theory is unconscious. So our personalities have memories, beliefs, urges, drives, and instinct that we're not necessarily all really that aware of at times, right? The subconscious or the unconscious. And the major driving force that Freud believed is in this instinctual theory is the concept of the libido. Now, you may have heard this term on different contexts, but and we'll kind of go over this in terms of that theory. So the libido is a natural energy source that fuels the mechanisms of the mind, right? How many of you have heard of libido before?
Yes.
Okay, what in what context did you hear libido?
I heard it in my philosophy class when I was in high school.
Okay, and do you remember what context that was? How they described libido?
Yeah, I know it is something that have that deal with sexual desire, right?
Yes, and that's similar. Thank you for bringing that up. And that's similar to really the driving force of what Freud proposed is we are driven by sex, we're driven by food, we're driven by nurturing, and those really emanate. So he described that as libidinal energy, and it's fixated at various stages of what he called the psychosexual development. So here's that's your key word is libido. Libido. Did I spell that correctly? I don't know. Yeah, I. Yes. Libido. And that is, we'll just put energy. And depending on the context, it could be sexual energy. I think most people are familiar with it in that term. Okay. So when this fixation occurs at different stages, conflicts occur that have lifelong effects. Thinking back to Erik Erikson, right? We kind of mentioned Freud with Erik Erikson. Erik Erikson's 8 stages of psychosocial development really spawned from Sigmund Freud's. Less sex, less the sex. He didn't really go too much into the sexuality of it. So fixation at a particular stage is what predicts adult personality according to Freud's theory. So for example, someone fixated at the oral stage, which is actually the first stage of psychosexual development, might have oral personality characteristics, like they might be overly talkative, or maybe they have a smoking habit when they grow up. All right. So that's just an example of what Freud would explain. So Freud breaks down these mental structures that I was talking about in 3 parts. And maybe some of you have seen this before. The theory of the iceberg. So if you know anything about icebergs, you know that we really only see a very small part of it that's above the water, because it's such a mass, a huge mass, that a majority of the weight and the mass exists below the surface. So he called the water line our awareness or conscience, okay? Depending on what book you read, I've seen it called different things, conscious, sorry. So either one is fine if you want to describe it that way. Anything above that conscious is things that we are overtly thinking about, actively thinking about, and we're aware of it. And then below that are forces at work that we don't necessarily know how to describe, or they may not be apparent to us. So let's break this down into two parts. So you got the iceberg on the top, and then below the water, everything that we're unaware of is the unconscious, right? I'll label that. All right. So according to Freud's theory, most of our mind is hidden below the surface. So let's go into the first structure of our mind, which is going to be the id. All right. So the id is located down here in this bottom compartment. So I'm just going to put id, and so that way I can kind of describe this as well. So the id is located down in this compartment, and it's the unconscious part of the mind. It makes up most of the mind, and it's hidden below the surface, and it develops right after birth. And if you think about that, children are very impulsive. They cry when they want, they they poop when they want, they kind of just do what they feel like doing, right? The demands of immediate gratification is what it's really all about when we're looking at the id. So I'm going to write that. Okay. So the second part that we're going to look at here is the ego. I'll write that over here. All right. So the ego is right here, as you can see, above the surface. I'm going to put a little bit below the surface because sometimes we have things like values that we're maybe not aware of, right? But they're still part of that ego. And I'll explain this in just a little bit as well. But the ego is involved in our perceptions, thoughts, and judgments. So I'm gonna put perceptions and judgments. Now it's important to understand that these judgments are ones that we're really aware of. Okay, we have an awareness, we're actively judging. This is all active. Okay, perceptions, and again, perceptions might exist below this, somewhere in the unconscious, not deep down, but we may have perceptions that just exist because we're automatically thinking in those terms, and sometimes we can't help them, right? So it seeks long-term gratification as opposed to the ids, which is immediate gratification. So we're actively thinking about it. In the third compartment right over here, we're going to fit in the superego. Oops. Superego. All right. So right over here is the superego, and I'm going to try and I got that fit in there, and that also exists in the awareness stage, but it resides primarily, according to Freud, below in the subconscious. Okay, and that's our moral compass, or our conscience. Okay, that don't get that confused with the conscious. Conscience is a little bit of a different thing to say. It's a little bit more difficult to say. But anyway, it's going to be the conscience. I'm going to write that as our conscience, not conscious. All right. So let's go back to our psychosexual stages that I was talking about. Our libidinal impulses, our libido right here, right? They want to be gratified. It is really our pleasure. It's whatever our immediate gratification is. And when they are either over gratified or not gratified at all, or maybe even partially gratified, fixation occurs at the psychosexual stage. and we face either conflict or anxiety. Now, what do I mean by conflict? It's not this whole battle or drama that plays out, but it's a conflict between these three mental structures and of our mind and the ego and the superego and the id, because all of these are competing for demands, and they're like in conflict, and they think of like I'm going to draw ourselves out here. If you can kind of picture, and I don't like this analogy, but if you can kind of picture, maybe you were in a situation or you've seen on the cartoon like Bugs Bunny or something, right before he's about to do something dubious. He's got like the angel on his right shoulder and the devil on his left shoulder. Maybe, do some of you recall that? Maybe not. All right. So what happens with those warring? You have the devil talking one thing into Bugs Bunny's ears, and then you have the angel telling Bugs Bunny to do something different, do something good, right? That's kind of what's happening. Now, the limitation I don't like about that, and so the superego is really Bugs Bunny. Bugs Bunny decides what he can really handle, or what he wants to do, and where he should lean, either to the devil's suggestion or to the angel's suggestion. So earlier explanations would say that the id is going to be the angel, and I'm sorry, the id is going to be the devil, and then the ego is going to be the angel. So really what is occurring there is, and the reason I don't like this explanation is because sometimes our desires are good. Sometimes our desires need to be fed. Maybe we have a desire to help somebody, right? That could be something that we want to immediately gratify, and that's okay too. So that's really one of the things I don't like about Freud's explanation or that picture, and that's really why I'm not going to put that on there. But it's kind of a fun little way to explain it. All right. So let's look at an example. One of the other things that we really see in the id is a Freudian slip. How many of you have heard of a Freudian slip? What is that? Has anybody heard of it? No? Freudian slip? Am I the only one that heard of this? Okay. So a Freudian slip, just to kind of give you some context here, is when we say things that we say things and we may not realize that we have said it. Okay. So what this was really meant to say is please don't, trying to think of a good example here. It's like a mental conflict, but it comes out in our speech. So for example, a financially stressed patient tells his doctor, "Oh, doctor, please don't give me any bills." And what he really meant to say was, "Don't give me any pills," because he had bills on the mind, and it came out. So anyway, this whole process that I just kind of wanted to use as an example. Sometimes they get crossed, and sometimes we say things that we don't mean. All right. So any questions? I'm not going to go through each one of the stages of Sigmund Freud. I think it's in your book, and I think he does a pretty good job explaining it in the book. So any questions on Freud so far? Any comments? Did that make sense?
Yes.
And I got a live group today.
Mm-hmm.
All right. All right. So let's look at now humanistic theory. Okay. So a little bit different, really a lot different than what Freud had proposed with his psychosexual theory of development and personality. Or this was developed, and you might remember the name Abraham Maslow, right? We talked about him with motivation. And he suggested that the key to self-actualization was first successfully climbing the hierarchy of more basic needs. And if you remember, we had that triangle, right? I'll draw that down here so I can put some other definitions. So we had really these different levels until we got to the top, which was self-actualization. And then at the bottom, of course, we had biological needs like food and sleep. and procreation, reproduction, biological. And then, of course, in here, belonging and love, safety, security, shelter, belonging, and then, of course, cognitive and aesthetic, okay? All that good stuff. So I'm not going to go through all those. You can refer to my previous notes regarding that. So what we really look at with the humanistic part of the theory, I kind of want to give you a caveat here. Now, all these theories of personality, they're not mutually exclusive. One might be more dominant over the other. One isn't necessarily better than the other, but all these theories are just different ways to look at how personality develops in people. Like, for example, there are still many people that subscribe to portions of Freud's psychoanalytical explanation of personality. They still exist. And we've really all come to different branches, you can say, of psychology with what is why they're from perspectives of different psychologists or theorists, okay? So the humanistic theory really says that individuals have free will and they can actually develop themselves to the highest potential to reach self-actualization or free will. So free will is an important term here, okay? So whenever I say free will, explanations of personality, we're talking about humanistic. And the term self-actualization, as I wrote down here. And somebody's drive to achieve self-actualization might be embedded in their personality, right? And it's another word for really defining this theory. So the primary difference between Freud's analytical theory and humanism is that Freud's theory was deterministic. So what do I mean by deterministic? Deterministic is the theory that says our behavior is determined by our unconscious desires. That's it. You can't change it. We're going to always be driven by our id, according to Freud. And his theory also focuses on individuals who have these mental conflicts, right? So what about people that don't have mental conflicts, right? Freud's explanation doesn't really delve into that. So if you don't have any conflict in your life, does that mean that you don't have any personality? You know, maybe, maybe not. Depends on what you believe in. Now, humanistic theory really focuses on the conscious as opposed to the unconscious. So Freud was focused on below the level of the conscious, and then humanistic theory really goes above the water, according to Freud's theory, right? And it also says that people are inherently good and that they are self-motivated to improve. Again, trying to achieve that self-actualization. And when we want to always improve because we want to reach that point. Now, the first major theorist was Abraham Maslow, and he formed the hierarchy of needs, which we really talked about here. And he says that we must fulfill our physiological needs, so on and so forth, right? Until we get up to self-actualization. Well, they must be self-aware, obviously. They are caring. They're wise, the people that are trying to achieve the self-actualization. And their interests are problem-centered. They focus their energies on the task that's really the mission of their life. And they have a higher purpose, and that's focused on larger causes, if you remember from when we talked about that. So they don't focus on basic aspects of life. They're always trying to strive and think broader for larger causes, and kind of think about where you fall in this. I mean, is self-actualization something that you're actively striving for? You remember, very few people get there, which is one of the major criticisms of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So, but Maslow believed only 1% of people ever reach self-actualization. So again, something for you to consider where you are and what you're striving for. The average person seeks actualization, self-actualization, but may never actually reach that point. So it looks like we all have something to work on together to do a little bit more. So are you going to strive to be like Mahatma Gandhi or Mother Teresa of our time. Those are people that we have estimated have reached self-actualization. So let's talk about a second major theorist in this in humanism. No, we'll known as Carl Rogers. So Carl Rogers used Maslow's idea and the qualities he described, and he says that they are nurtured early in life. He said that self-actualization is a constant growth process that is nurtured in the growth promoting climate. So that's really another way, another very important word is growth promoting climate. Climate, sorry. Okay. And this climate, in order for this climate to help someone reach self-actualizations, there's two conditions that need to be met. The first is that growth is nurtured. Okay. So for this to happen, growth is nurtured. And that happens when the individual is being genuine. So one has to be open and revealing about themselves. They have to be genuine and true to who they are. And the second condition that needs to be met is growth is nurtured through genuine. Growth is also nurtured through acceptance and acceptance of others. So what he is saying here, Carl Rogers is saying here, is that we have to see somebody that isn't really out to gain anything. So they're genuine and they accept themselves and they accept them other people. That's when we can see true self-actualization. Now, many of us exist on different scales of this. Maybe we do accept ourselves, but we're not all-encompassing accepting of others, right? And if you think of like the Dalai Lama, if anybody's ever seen any videos on Dalai Lama, he at least he presents himself as genuine and self-accepting and accepting of others, right? You don't really see him get mad or anything. He has like a idea of larger purposes, right? So he would be a great example. So somebody who's in the self-accepting stage, they receive acceptance and receive unconditional positive regard from others. So what does that mean? So for example, a parent might get upset at their child and punish them for doing something wrong, but then they're going to still love their child and regard their child without any conditions, okay? So no matter what, so this allows us to really be open and learn without fearing others are going to look at us differently if we do something wrong. And genuine relationships with others and acceptance is what allows us to live up to the ideals of our true real self versus the ideal self. Okay, so that's big here. So our true, again, this kind of feeds into the growth and nurture of genuine. True self, not ideal self. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. All right. So anyway, both Maslow and Rogers, they said that a central feature of our personality is self-concept. Okay, that's really what it is, how we view ourselves and how we consider ourselves. And that's achieved when we bring genuineness, acceptance together and achieve this growth promoting climate. So as to tend to act and perceive the world in a positive way. All right. So anyway, those are two explanations. Now, we also have trait theory. Okay. We're going to talk about trait theory in this slide. So what better way to describe individual personalities than by using traits? And bear with me here a second. So within trait theory, It's very much a straightforward approach to describe personality. We do it every day. It basically defines personality in terms of identifiable patterns of behavior, so that this is really the key word is pattern of behavior. We look at patterns, things that repeat over time, patterns of behavior. So this kind of takes away from the conscious and subconscious realm a little bit. I mean, it does kind of intertwine with it, but not nearly as much. It's not nearly as explained like it is in the humanistic and psychoanalytical. And I'll explain that here in just a little bit more in depth. So it describes traits instead of explaining them, as in many other personality theories do. So this theory uses description versus explanation. Very important. Okay. Describes, not explain. So the other ones explain where they come from. This one just describes where they are. Okay. So what exactly is a trait? Now, if someone asks you to describe your best friend, what kind of things would you say? Maybe you would say your best friend was funny. Maybe you would say they're loyal. Maybe you would say they're kind of cool as a cucumber, right? Well, all of these words that I just gave you represents really a trait. A trait can be thought of as a relatively stable characteristic, all right? And that's another word that we're going to put in here is stable characteristic. Characteristic. Okay. And what do I mean by stable? So stable, again, it causes the individual to consistently behave a certain way every time. Okay. And that's what's unique to each individual. No two people have the exact same personality. They might be close. We can even see that within our families, right? Even though we grew up in the same system, the same house, and have the same values, we might all be different with it. In fact, that usually happens, right? Even though we share those same genes, right? We all have different personalities because we all possess each of us have different traits. Well, let's go into different theorists. So of within the trait theory. So let's see here. So the first one that tests theories that I'm going to describe today is the Myers-Briggs. Maybe some of you have heard of it. Maybe some of you have taken it. If you, people work, sometimes they'll, management offers Myers-Briggs to see what kind of personality a person has and whether they're going to be adaptable to that environment. So I don't know if you've seen this before, but if you did, great. But basically it gives you a set of 4 letters that categorizes you into one of 16 personality traits. Okay. And within 16 traits. Within each one of those personality traits, there's a set of traits and behaviors. So you tend to dominate one of those traits in everyday life. So anyways, if you haven't checked those types of personality tests, they're all online. A lot of them have a little bit, they are a little bit different, but they're certainly available. Highly recommend it. It's kind of cool to see where you fall on some of this stuff, right? And really there's a fun way to get to know yourself and your tendencies a little bit better. So I'm always curious, and I always like to take these just for fun, just to kind of see how these different sites project who I am. Some of them are spot on, at least I feel they are, but some of them vary quite differently. So individual traits theories differ in terms of whether or not they believe that all individuals possess the same traits. And I'll get into that in just a little bit, and you'll see why that is. So let's go through the first theorist, named Gordon Allport. Now, Gordon Allport, what he said is that all of us have different traits, hence trait theory, right? He didn't believe that all individuals have the same traits. In fact, he said that he could differ amongst individuals, and he actually came up with a list of about 4,500 different descriptive words to describe traits. And that wasn't the original list. Initially, he had a trait list of about 10,000. So that I think he decided he needed to cut back a little bit for budget reasons or whatever. That'd be a pain in the neck trying to catalog 10,000 traits. Anyway, I think that's kind of cool. So anyway, from those 4,500 traits, he was able to come up with 3 basic categories of traits. Okay, categories of traits. According to Allport, first one is cardinal traits. Okay, I'll explain what each of these are in a minute. The second one is central traits. And then the third one is going to be secondary traits. Now, other theorists have gone on to say that we have like tertiary traits and, you know, so on and so forth. Of course, a lot of people build on original theories. But of these 3 traits, the cardinal traits are characteristics that direct most of the person's activities. So these are the dominant traits. And usually most permanent. They last throughout the entire life of a person. So for example, one person might have a cardinal trait of selflessness or power motivation, but Allport says that not all individuals have selflessness or power motivation, right? So that's really the key right there. Individuals have some subsets of traits from universal possibility of traits, but not all individuals have the same traits. And we can really mix and match those, right? We all possess different ones. Now, these cardinal traits influence all of our other behaviors, including the central and secondary traits or dispositions, which those influence behavior to a lesser degree. So these are dominant. Okay, so dominant, I'm going to also put primary, really, because again, those traits kind of feed into the other traits. So an example of an essential trait is honesty, right? But for the central trait. So honesty might be part of our makeup, or sociability, or maybe even shyness, which are less dominant than these cardinal traits. And they're a little bit more fluid, right? We can kind of change our shyness, or we can maybe at times be dishonest for different reasons. Going back to Kohlberg's moral development, right? There might be different reasons why we choose to be dishonest, to protect somebody or to help somebody, right? So a secondary trait is something like love for art, or maybe reluctance to eat meat and be a vegetarian or a vegan. These are more preferences. And again, like central, they may even be a little bit more fluid, okay? And it could be preferences or attitudes, but anyway, so that's a little bit about Gordon Allport. So along comes a guy named Raymond Cattell. Now, Raymond Cattell thought that 4,500 was a little excessive. So he started mixing and matching and trying to fit them a little bit more into a neater subset, which he called the 16 essential personality traits. Just gonna put essential traits. Okay. Really, that's all that we do. He said that we represent the basic dimensions of personality with those 16 And he turned these 16 personality factors questionnaire, which is the 16 PF for short. Maybe some of you have seen or heard of that. And that was his contribution. So he categorized all of our traits into 16 personality traits that we all possess. All right. And then we have, so reduced from 4,500, really, and created the 16 personality factor, the 16 PF. All right. Next, we have Hans Eysenck. Eysenck. All right. So what Eysenck did, his theory is based on the assumption that we all have three major dimensions. Okay. And these three major dimensions of personality encompass all traits we all possess, but to the degree of which we individually express them are differently. So a little bit different from Allport. He said that we have different unique subsets of traits. So Eysenck is saying that we all have these traits, but we express them at different degrees. So there are three major dimensions to his theory. So I'm going to put three dimensions. And the first is extroversion. Okay. So many of you probably know what extroversion is, okay? Extroversion versus introversion, and that's the degree of sociability. The second is neuroticism. Okay, within neuroticism, it's our emotional stability. Okay, I'm going to put sociability here. Sociability. All right. And then the third is psychoticism. Oops. All right, got that. Psychoticism is spelled right. And that's the degree to which reality is distorted. All right. So I know I said Eysenck said we possess all of these traits that lie in these three categories, but you know, I've got them displayed here. And all right, yeah, it looks like they're so well. Let me caveat something else here, because Eysenck said that we all have varying degrees of extroversion and neuroticism, but not necessarily psychoticism. So these could vary a little bit. So moving on, the last major trait theory that we cover in the trait theory is Big Five. Kind of, again, expanding on what other people have looked at. All right, so our Big Five, it's found all over in people across different populations, but for the most part, this is a relatively stable theory. And the first major personality in the Big Five is openness. And what is it meant by openness? It is really what we're looking at. Are you independent, or are you conforming? Are you imaginative, or are you practical? Okay, so really that's what openness is. And by the way, a fun little acronym here is OCEAN. I'm going to kind of go through each one of these in that order. So our next one is consciousness. Conscientiousness, sorry. Conscientiousness. I have somebody that's off of mute right now. If you wouldn't mind just checking to make sure you're on mute. And that's really, conscientiousness is asking the question, are you careful or careless? Okay. All right. Do you care about other people, or are you more looking inwards towards yourself? Are you disciplined, or are you impulsive? Are you organized or disorganized? Okay, so that really is what we look at with conscientiousness. Okay, and third is extroversion, similar to PSYC, right? We're seeing that one reappear. Extroversion. And again, we're asking the questions, are you talkative or are you quiet? Are you fun-loving or are you kind of somber or sober? The fourth is agreeableness. Oops, I think I misspelled that. Agreeable. I think I got that right. Yeah, agreeableness. All right, we're looking at agreeableness. We're asking questions. Are you kind or are you cold? Are you appreciative or unfriendly? And of course, the last one we also saw from PSYC is neuroticism. Makes another appearance here in our big five, okay? So according to neuroticism, we're asking questions, are you stable or are you tense? Are you calm or are you anxious? Are you secure or are you insecure? So the best way that I really, again, learned to memorize these is OCEAN. So you have OCEAN. Pretty simple, right? So Cattell and PSYC and the big five, all over what you see we used here are something called factor analysis. So all of these, I'm just going to write this down here. So they use factor analysis to come up with these categories for our traits. So factor analysis is a statistical method, and these categorize and determines are major categories of traits. And Allport's theory did not necessarily use that. He relied on different procedures to determine traits. So basically, factor analysis reduces the number of variables, and it really detects structure in relationships between the variables. And any of you that have stats would probably understand that a little bit better. And we all do this because we want to classify variables. So in the past, probably at the time of Cattell and PSYC, all of this was really done by hand, okay? And the possible combinations of determining the number of categories of traits was all done by hand, which could have induced a lot of errors. Now we have all sorts of handy assessment tools that really look at that stuff for us, okay? And it uses a complex number of equations to figure this out for us, okay? So really, and I'm trying to think of if we have time here. So there are many ways to really look at personality, engage personality. And we have two ways. I'm just going to personality. We have objective ways to do it. And we have subjective ways. Now, objective ways, these are more fact-based. These are observable. These are things that if somebody says on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the best day of my life, 1 being the worst day, I feel like I'm about an 8. That is more objective. There's some subjectivity in there because it really depends on, but to that person, they are at almost about the best point of their life. That's how they're feeling. So we can say that is an objective way to score somebody. Or yeah, I have said less than 5 curse words today. That's objective because we can count. Subjective, on the other hand, is a little bit different. Subjective is somewhat based on norms, but it doesn't stand up to validity and reliability the way objective ones do. So subjective are more opinion based and more kind of wishy-washy and ethereal, if you will. Okay, so a little bit harder to gauge. And one of the things I wanted to present to you today is what's called the ink blot test. Okay, so many of you have heard about that. Has anybody heard of the ink blot test, the Rorschach?
Yes.
Okay, what do you know about the Rorschach?
It's like an ink block test, and like you look at it and you see what they ask you what you see, basically.
Okay. All right, let's see if I can get my screen to share. There we go. All right. So where is my screen? Too many screens open here. Way too many screens open. All right. So what I'm going to do is just kind of go through these and let you know what these are. Okay. So what we do with the Rorschach test is we might ask somebody that's taking a personality test, we might ask them to sit down, and the psychometrist or the psychologist will present the cards and say, what do you see here? Okay. So for example, what does anybody want to care what they see here? Anybody?
I see a moth.
Okay. That's actually a very popular one. Okay. A lot of people say like bat, butterfly, or even moth. And what this is doing is this is dragging out, if you remember back toward when we're talking about Freud says we have these inner like subconscious feelings, and the idea of these subjectivity, the subjective test is that it brings out what some of these automatic thoughts are that we may not even be aware of, right? So, many of you probably answered bat, butterfly, or moth, or maybe you answered something differently, but we're going to look at what they see. And based on what they see, it could involve action. It could involve like the act of moving around or something. Some people get really, really creative, and depending on that answer, we can mark that down and say, they might be harboring some kind of negative energy, like or did not resolve a conflict with their libido from childhood or something like that, right? So that's just one example, and of course we have different examples. So what would you say you see here?
That looks a bit like a jack-o'-lantern, with the orange paint on top and the bottom, and I can see like the round part and the stem.
Okay. Anybody else?
My
Me-
first instinct.
Go ahead.
I did one. You did this one.
Yeah, I said I see like two men that is fighting or something like that.
Okay. Anybody else? So maybe fighting. Some people might say two humans playing patty cake or something like that. So this one I like to present as kind of a training one, because some people might see blood, or they might see distinctive colors in this one, which can really provide an indication of how the subject is likely to manage feelings of anger or physical harm. So this card is really good at really inducing a variety of sexual responses, believe it or not, which sets us up for other cards later on. Okay, so people might see this. So they're presented in a certain order, and I'm not going to ask every one of you, but this one has a little bit more depth. All right, and this one is a sexuality card, for example. So that might give the assessor an indication of maybe some kind of harbored sexuality issues or something like that. Okay. So anyway, these are really, and they go all the way through. We got 10 of them. So anyway, I just wanted to show you what they look like and how they work. Now, a lot of these have been normed on many, through many of years, trying to assess what people, like the normal average of people, see, and then they compare them to any kind of diagnosis or psychosis that they may have experienced in their life, right? So pretty cool. So that's an example of subjective tests. They have other subjective tests like the thematic apperception test, which gives us an idea of somebody's cognitive abilities, right? When we're talking about cognitive abilities, but it also gives us an indication, some insight into their personality as well. All right, so those are the subjective tests. Now, objective tests, similar to the Myers-Briggs. Okay, Myers-Briggs was very similar to other tests that we use, and they are highly reliable. We look at reliability and validity. Are they going to be consistent over time with that person, right? Is it measuring what we want it to do? And of course, the most popular personality test is the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which is a total of 567 questions, and they're really just true or false. It takes a while to get through them, but at the end, I like using the MMPI because it tells me if somebody is trying to answer positively or negatively, like they're trying to present themselves in a positive light depending on how they answer. Like, for example, one of the questions is, I like to read mechanics magazines, right? Somebody that might answer yes to that and yes to a string of other ones that are just kind of weird might indicate that the person is trying to look favorable in some way. So anyway, MMPI is really good for that. And then we have the PAI, Personality Assessment Inventory, and Mackey, I mean, just tons of them. So depending on what, if any of you are going into psychology or psychometrics, it might depend on what the context is. If you're in a hospital or versus in a private practice, which one of these tests you might want to use. Okay, so really, that's all I got for today. Does anybody have any questions? Did I do a good job explaining this? Did I make a little bit more sense with some of these theories and how we assess them?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, good. Glad to hear.
Yes.
All right. Does anybody have anything to add?
Yes,
Go
I
ahead.
have a question.
Yeah.
It is about the personality. Can we say that personality is something fixed or something that can change over the time?
Well, it depends on which one of these theories you follow. But I would say collectively, I think all of them would point that we have primary traits. We have primary personality traits that, like, for example, if we are if we look at conscientiousness, if we are a selfless person and we look out for the welfare of others, that remains pretty stable over time. Now, things happen. We have trauma that occurs in our life. We have medical issues that happen that might, and if you look at Maslow's theory, it might revert us back to survival instinct. So that could have a deep impact on our personality, right? Like, for example, you have somebody that their personality is selfless. They'll help anybody, and they're out involved in the community and doing things. Maybe that's central, according to PSYC, that central trait might be affected if that person gets assaulted or encounters some kind of sexual assault or physical assault or is seriously wounded. That might change. So we might see some of those personality traits change over time. That individual, that volunteer might be less trusting, and we could see that follow a personality change. So I'm not saying it doesn't change. It largely remains stable throughout the life of the person. Okay.
Okay.
All right, so I'm going to stop recording.